I can't believe you spent all this money just to embarrass yourself. These were the words that cut through me like a knife as I stood frozen in the living room of my Aunt Margie's house on 24th Street in downtown Savannah, Georgia. At exactly 5:17 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1978, I was 7 years old, and I had spent the entire month sneaking coins from my piggy bank, saving $21.63, and helping Mom wrap presents for everyone in the family hoping to create a Christmas that would feel magical. Instead, I was shivering in a hand-me-down wool sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs and the faint aroma of burnt cookies that lingered from my attempt at baking earlier. That afternoon, the whole room glittered with tinsel and colorful lights that blinked a rhythm that felt almost mocking as relatives laughed and passed plates of roasted turkey and candied yams around. I could feel my cheeks burning not from the cold, but from the realization that all my effort had gone unnoticed. My carefully chosen gift for my older cousin Larry, a wooden train set I had saved 3 weeks of allowance to buy from Mr. Henderson's toy store on Bull Street, was tossed aside without a glance. "Thanks, I guess," Larry said with a shrug and a smirk that made my stomach twist. I remember counting the seconds as the laughter of my aunts and uncles bounced off the walls, and the grandfather clock in the corner ticked toward 5:33 p.m., the precise moment I felt my tiny world crumble around me. I had imagined smiles, hugs, and a feeling of belonging. Instead, I got ridicule and neglect. The living room smelled of pine from the artificial tree and the faint metallic scent of the new ornaments reflecting the orange glow of the fireplace. I remember thinking in that instant that maybe Christmas was not for me. Maybe no matter what I did, I would always be left out and ignored. I can still hear the sound of my cousin Tommy filming the scene with his little Kodak Brownie camera saying, "Oh, wow, look at her face, it's priceless," capturing every moment of my humiliation on film, and I felt a rush of anger mixed with a deep sinking sadness that made my hands tremble against the cool wood banister. My socks had holes in the heels, and my shoes squeaked on the polished hardwood as I backed into a corner, trying to make myself invisible, and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen mingled with the perfume of my Aunt Margie as she fussed over the cranberry sauce while whispering to my mother about how kids these days just don't appreciate effort. I could hear every word, and it pierced me like shards of glass. The room was alive with chatter and music from the old radio playing Jingle Bells in a scratchy mono sound, yet I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my own body, as if someone else was being tormented, while I could only watch and feel powerless. The texture of the crocheted blanket I had brought to sit on the floor for warmth was rough against my skin, and I clutched it like a shield, trying to hide tears that threatened to fall. And the clock ticked to 5:45 p.m., marking exactly 28 minutes since the first cruel words were spoken. But something shifted inside me. A tiny ember of defiance ignited as I realized that in 15 minutes I would make a decision that no one in that room expected to see. A little girl would find a way to assert herself and take back the dignity that had been stripped away from her. I could feel the heat of determination replacing the cold, and the fear plan began to form in my mind. And I pressed my small hands against the chestnut banister and whispered to myself, "I'm not going to let this define me." The lights reflected in my wide eyes, and the sound of my own heartbeat seemed louder than the laughter around me. The combination of embarrassment, fear, and anticipation created a pressure in my chest that I knew would fuel everything to come. In reality of being 7 and alone in a room full of adults who didn't see me at that moment became the catalyst for a story that would not end in shame. And the scent of pine and cinnamon from the cookies mixed with the faint tang of cleaning polish from the freshly mopped floor created a sensory memory that burned itself into my mind. And even as the family sang carols and sipped eggnog, I was plotting quietly, waiting for the exact right moment to act, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. The sound of silverware clinking, plates scraping, and the faint buzz of the old electric heater created a rhythm like a drumbeat marking the seconds until my small but powerful intervention. And I can promise you that what happened next changed everything for that night and every Christmas after that. And if you have ever felt invisible, ignored, or humiliated, leave a comment below, share your story. Because the moment you realize your own power, it can turn even the coldest laughter into awe and respect. And you will see that even the smallest person can make the biggest impact in exactly 15 minutes. Looking back now, I realize that Christmas 1978 was not just another holiday. It was a culmination of a year of sacrifices that started on January 3rd, when my mom handed me $2.47 from the coins we had saved together and asked me to help buy groceries. And every week after school, I would walk down Liberty Street to Mr. Robinson's market balancing my $5 weekly allowance and carrying cans of beans and sugar, weighing exactly 12 pounds in my little hands. I remember the texture of the brown paper bags and the sound of the cash register dinging every time I handed over exact change. I had learned the value of money and effort early, and by December I had saved $21.63, which felt like a fortune to a 7-year-old, and I had spent countless hours cutting out pictures from the Sears catalog to craft handmade cards with glitter and colored pencil illustrations for each member of my family. I even woke up at 5:12 a.m. on December 14th. to help Mom hang the string of red and green lights along the roof of our small house on Maple Avenue in Savannah. The bulbs were cold and prickly against my fingers, and the wind smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke from the neighbor's house. I had helped wrap 72 presents this year, meticulously folding the edges and tying perfect bows, and the smell of the new wrapping paper mixed with the faint odor of Mom's lavender soap filled every room in our house. I had gone without a single candy bar. I had skipped my favorite Saturday matinee showing of Scooby-Doo at the old Georgia Theater to save every penny I could spare, and yet every ounce of effort seemed to evaporate in front of Aunt Margie's house. As I stood in the corner shivering in my mothball-scented sweater, my heart pounding to the rhythm of laughter and conversation that excluded me, I remember the flashback to November 23rd, when I spent 3 hours helping Uncle Pete set up the turkey roaster in his kitchen, measuring exactly 18 cups of water to steam the vegetables and cleaning every pan until it gleamed while everyone else lounged watching the evening news. I thought that my contribution mattered, that my presence mattered, that my small efforts would be recognized and appreciated. But little by little, the signs of indifference had started. Months before the cruel words of that evening, I noticed how Cousin Larry's eyes would roll when I brought my drawings to show him, or how Aunt Margie would mutter under her breath about how kids these days are too sensitive. The first subtle dismissal came when I wrapped a tin of homemade cookies in shiny red paper on December 1st, and she said, "Oh, those would be nice for the trash can," with a smirk that still echoes in my memory. I had learned to ignore it at first, thinking she was joking, or that perhaps I misunderstood the tone. But by the day of the Christmas party, all my careful calculations and meticulous planning had been completely dismissed, and the environment that I had built with love and precision seemed meaningless. I remember the details of that afternoon, vividly: the sound of my sneakers squeaking on the polished hardwood floors, the way the tinsel on the tree reflected in the shiny silver ornaments, casting little glimmers of light across the ceiling, the faint crackle of the vinyl record playing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in the corner of the room, and the warm scent of vanilla from the candles burning on the mantel blending with the musty odor of old furniture and faded drapes. I could see the expressions of my aunts and uncles. Their smiles forced their glances fleeting and dismissive, and I remember thinking how strange it was that all my careful investment in this family event counted for nothing, how my time, my money, and my love had been ignored, and yet I could not speak up because I was a child, and children were not allowed to disrupt the ritual of adult laughter and adult enjoyment. And so I stayed in the corner observing the scene, every little detail etched into my mind like a blueprint for the future. The way the cranberry sauce jigged in the bowl when someone nudged it with a fork, the sound of Aunt Margie's heels clicking against the tiles in the kitchen, and the soft rustle of the paper wrapping as gifts were exchanged. I could feel a growing tension in my chest, a mixture of longing and frustration that no one noticed. I had made the table runner by hand, spending exactly 6 hours threading beads and sewing a fabric of deep forest green and gold that I thought would be a focal point for everyone. But Larry and Tommy ignored it completely, and Aunt Margie walked past without a single comment. I felt invisible. I felt my 7-year-old world shrinking around me, and yet at the same time a seed of determination was planted in that very moment, that even if they could not see me, I would find a way to be recognized and respected. And the faint smell of Mom's cinnamon coffee brewing in the background reminded me that not all efforts are futile, and that the love you put into something can give you strength even when the world seems blind to it. So as you listen to this story, I want you to remember every act of kindness, every sacrifice, every moment where you gave your best. And it seemed ignored, because sometimes the greatest victories come from the moments where we feel unseen. And what happened next in my story is something you will not want to miss. So stay with me and watch closely, because in just a few minutes, the situation takes a turn that nobody in that room expected. And I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if all your effort was dismissed and all your love overlooked? Because the answer may surprise you. As the clock struck 6:02 p.m., I felt the first wave of humiliation wash over me again when Cousin Larry held up my carefully wrapped train set and announced in front of everyone, "Wow, you actually spent $21.63 on this. I can't believe you wasted your money." His words dripping with mockery, and the laughter that followed echoed off the walls of Aunt Margie's living room like a chorus of cruelty. I remember the exact way the wooden train glinted under the yellow light of the chandelier as it spun in. His hands and how the texture of the pine trees. I had carved myself scraped against my palm as I tried to grab it back, and when I whispered, "Please don't laugh at me," Mom glanced over nervously and muttered, "Larry, that's enough." But it was too late. The moment had been captured. Tommy was already filming with his Kodak Brownie, and I could hear the whirring sound of the film advancing and the faint metallic click that made me feel like the humiliation was being tattooed into eternity. I had tried to intervene earlier by showing my handmade cards to Aunt Margie at 5:50 p.m., and she said with a dismissive flick of her hand, "Those are cute, dear, but put them away now." I remember the crunch of the paper as I folded them slowly back into my bag, and the faint smell of wax crayon lingering in the air. I could feel my heart racing and my small fists clenching and unclenching in my lap as Cousin Larry continued, "I don't know why you even bothered decorating with that cheap tinsel. It looks like a dollar store nightmare." His tone sharp and arrogant, and the adults around the room chuckled politely, but none of them defended me, and even Uncle Pete, who usually smiled at my efforts, avoided eye contact. I tried to speak up again, saying, "I helped hang the lights, and I counted the bulbs exactly 36. But Larry just laughed louder and threw a pillow in my direction, hitting the back of my chair, and the sound echoed like a drumbeat of shame the neighbors who had come to the party to see the Christmas. Decorations could only watch from the kitchen doorway, their faces frozen, in a mix of surprise and awkward sympathy, and I could hear Mrs. Thompson whisper to Mr. Thompson, "I can't believe how cruel children can be to each other these days." And I felt a burning sensation in my cheeks and shiver that was more emotional than physical as the temperature of the room felt colder than the 68 degrees on the thermostat. The string of red and green lights I had carefully untangled and hung only hours before now seemed to mock me with their cheerful blink, and the smell of pine mixed with the faint burnt aroma of cookies I had baked earlier made my stomach churn. I tried to redirect attention by offering the freshly baked cookies to anyone willing to try, but Larry swatted the plate away, saying, "Gross, these are probably full of dirt anyway." And the room erupted into laughter again, and even my own mother looked embarrassed and turned away. I could feel every single second stretching endlessly as if time itself was conspiring against me, and when I tried to take the train set back from Larry, he shouted, "Stop whining, it's not that big of a deal," and Aunt Margie said with a sigh, "Let's not make a scene, dear." And the word stung because my effort was being minimized again and again. I remember the sound of the film camera advancing in Tommy's hands, the clack, 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 like a countdown marking each second of my humiliation, and I looked around the room desperately for an ally, anyone to notice my pain, but only strangers and neighbors watched silently, and yet the silence felt worse than the laughter, because it validated the cruelty I was experiencing, and I felt the weight of every snicker and smirk pressing down on my tiny shoulders. By 6:28 p.m., I had reached my limit. The combination of mockery, neglect, and dismissive gestures had crossed a line. I could feel the tension building in my chest, my hands trembling not from cold, but from anger and hurt, and I realized in that exact moment that this would not be ignored any longer, and I whispered under my breath, "I will not let this continue." The air felt thick with anticipation, my wool sweater prickling against my skin like tiny needles, and I could hear the faint hum of the old electric heater in the corner, mixing with the faint jingle of bells from the record, and the occasional clink of a fork against a plate, and the smell of fresh coffee from the kitchen now mingled with the acrid scent of my own fear and determination. I knew that this was a turning point that would have been a simple evening of gifts and cheer had transformed into a test of my resolve, and the presence of neighbors watching from the doorway, the flash of Tommy's camera lens, the faint gasp of my cousins, and the hushed whispers of the adults around me all created a stage where the moment I decided to act would be witnessed and remembered, and I could feel the tiny ember of defiance grow into a flame of clarity. And as the clock approached 6:35 p.m., I made a silent vow that in the next few minutes everything would change, and what they all saw as a powerless 7-year-old about to be humiliated would become the catalyst for a revelation none of them will forget. So stay with me, because what happens next is the moment where the powerless becomes powerful and the tables begin to turn. And I want you to ask yourself in these moments of escalating humiliation, when every attempt to Be seen as dismissed? What would you do? Because the answer is coming, and it will shock you. At exactly 6:36 p.m., I felt a clarity wash over me like a sudden ray of sunlight piercing the dark clouds of humiliation that had enveloped me for over an hour. In that moment, standing in the corner of Aunt Margie's living room on 24th Street in Savannah, Georgia, shivering not from the cold, but from the intensity of my emotions, I realized that this was no longer about candy or toys or even recognition. This was about asserting my dignity and reclaiming control over my own life. The laughter around me had dulled into a background hum. The blinking lights on the Christmas tree reflected in my eyes like tiny stars marking the beginning of something monumental. The aroma of burnt sugar from the cookies I had baked mingled with the pine scent of the tree and the faint whiff of Aunt Margie's Chanel No. 5 perfume, and I could feel the rough texture of my hand-me-down sweater against my skin, reminding me of every sacrifice I had made in the past 3 weeks, saving exactly $21.63, walking 1.2 miles to Mr. Henderson's toy store to pick out the perfect gift, measuring and wrapping 72 presents, spending 6 hours on the forest green and gold crocheted table runner, and waking up at precisely 5:12 a.m. to help Mom hang the lights. I realized that all this effort had built not just gifts, but a hidden arsenal of patience, resourcefulness, and meticulous planning. The laughter around me no longer intimidated me. It fueled a quiet determination. And I remembered the exact moment 3 weeks ago when I had overheard Mom on the phone with Uncle Pete, saying that sometimes children needed to learn to stand up for themselves. And I realized now that the lesson was about to come full circle. And I began to make a plan in my mind, calculating every step like a small general preparing for battle. I knew I had until exactly 6:50 p.m. when the adults would likely begin opening the last of the presents, and I resolved that by then I would act, and the plan was not impulsive. It was deliberate and precise. The neighbors who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, the faces frozen in curiosity, the subtle click of Tommy's brownie camera, capturing every motion of mine, would all witness the transformation. I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards under my small feet as I shifted to a better vantage point, my hands pressed against the cool banister, the faint scent of lavender soap and burnt cookies filling my senses. As I drew in a deep breath and whispered to myself, I will not accept this any longer. I remember the 3 days of preparation I had spent observing my family, noting their routines, their blind spots, their arrogance, and their dismissiveness, and I realized that every small detail I had cataloged was now an asset. The clock ticked 6:40 p.m., the room alive with conversation, and clinking plates of metallic hum of the heater, blending with the soft jingle of the record spinning Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Yet I felt a calm focus washing over me, like a shield protecting me from their mockery, and the faint scratch of the pencil on the gift tags from earlier that afternoon seemed like a prelude to my strategic intervention. I considered Aunt Margie's habitual dismissals and Larry's arrogance, and I knew exactly where to strike, where my voice and actions would carry maximum weight. And the memory of the rough pine train set in my hands reminded me that small things carried significance when wielded with intent. I saw Tommy aiming the camera lens toward me, and I allowed him to think I was still powerless. The neighbors leaning on the doorframe whispered, "She looks like she's about to cry." Yet I felt no tears, only a simmering fire building into something unstoppable. The room smelled a pine of cinnamon, a faint sweat from the heated conversation, and I felt each aroma sharpen my senses and heighten my awareness. I made a silent vow to myself that by 6:50 p.m., exactly every insult, every sneer, every dismissive glance would be met with a response that they would never forget. And the first hint of my hidden power began to manifest not in anger, but in strategy and precision, in the ability to turn observation and patience into influence. And I felt a thrill unlike anything I had experienced before, the sensation of standing on the precipice of change and knowing that in mere minutes the dynamics of the room would shift in my favor. And as I surveyed the room, the laughter, the whispers, the smirks, I realized that the humiliation they had inflicted on me was now a tool, a catalyst for transformation. And I whispered under my breath again, "The game is about to change." And the warmth of that declaration spread through my small body. The ruffle of my sweater grounded me, the faint tick of the grandfather clock in a corner marking each heartbeat, and each second drawing closer to the moment where I would step out of invisibility and into power. And I want you to consider for yourself in your own life, what would you do if all your patience and every sacrifice had been dismissed? How would you transform humiliation into strategy? And I promise you that what happens next is a revelation of power you never saw coming. And if you felt invisible, dismissed, or underestimated in your life, pay attention closely, because this is a moment where the powerless begins to rise. At exactly 6:50 p.m., I stood up in the corner of Aunt Margie's living room, the wooden train, sat still in my hands, and for the first time that evening, every eye in the room turned toward me. The laughter faded into an uneasy silence, and I felt the heat of anticipation mingling with the cold, prickly texture of my wool sweater against my arms. And I began to speak, my voice steady, clear, and surprisingly authoritative for a 7-year-old. I said, "Larry, I want you to look at what I have done," and I sat. The train sat carefully on the polished hardwood floor, the lights of the tree glinting off its polished wooden surface, and the neighbors in the doorway gasped softly. And I saw the flash of Tommy's camera lens capture every inch of the scene. I continued. "I saved exactly $21.63 of this gift, and I spent 3 weeks measuring, wrapping, and planning everything I wanted to give something meaningful, not just a toy." And the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater and the crackle of the record playing softly in the corner. I could see the realization starting to dawn on Larry's face, and Aunt Margie's lips pressed together tightly. And I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small envelope I had kept hidden for weeks. Inside, it were 3 receipts from Mr. Henderson's toy store, dated December 12th, December 15th, and December 20th, each showing exact amount spent on gifts for the family, and a handwritten note listing every hour I had spent crafting and preparing for this day. The neighbors whispered she planned all of this herself, and I felt the weight of their eyes on me, yet the confidence in my posture only grew, and I looked at Larry directly and said, "I did all this, and you treated it like nothing." And for the first time, he seemed unsure, fumbled his words. "I didn't mean," and I shook my head slowly, "but it's not about what you meant, it's about what you did." And at that moment, Aunt Margie's face changed from dismissive to stunned, and she muttered under her breath, "I never realized she could do this." And I continued to reveal more evidence, showing how I had arranged the decorations to highlight the handmade ornaments I had sewn with Mom's help and the small gifts I had wrapped meticulously, noting every detail. The neighbors leaned forward, their eyes wide in astonishment, and Tommy's camera clicked, rapidly capturing every reaction. And I felt the shift in the room, the balance of power tilting in my favor. The adults who had mocked me now murmured amongst themselves, and I could see the disbelief in their faces as the truth became undeniable. I even had the courage to mention the time I had spent observing routines and patterns to understand the best way to make the gifts meaningful, and the exact hours I had dedicated to ensuring every detail would matter. The effect was instantaneous. Larry's smirk faltered completely, and he muttered, "I guess I underestimated you." And Aunt Margie's shoulders slumped as she realized the oversight, and the room filled with a mixture of awe and respect. The neighbors whispered excitedly. She turned the whole situation around, and I could feel the tiny ember of empowerment inside me ignite into a roaring fire. And I said softly but firmly, "Sometimes the smallest person can make the biggest difference." And at that moment, my mother's eyes glistened with pride, and she murmured, "I should have seen this sooner." And I felt the culmination of all those weeks of effort, planning, and sacrifice crystallize into undeniable proof that my power had always been there, hidden beneath vulnerability and shyness. And the camera captured the collective shock, the gasp, the sudden silence, the acknowledgement of every insult, every dismissal being overturned by the evidence in my hands. And as I stood tall on the polished floor, the smell of pine cinnamon and the faint metallic tang of the train tracks around me, I realized that the humiliation had not destroyed me. It had prepared me to demonstrate something far greater. The neighbors clapped softly. Some whispered, "She's remarkable." And I felt an exhilarating thrill of triumph coursing through my veins, and I knew that from this moment forward, nobody would underestimate me again. The way I had been treated could no longer define my worth, and the entire room had witnessed it firsthand. And if you have ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated, remember that preparation, patience, and persistence are your hidden weapons, and what seemed like powerlessness can become your greatest strength. And if this revelation resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to see that even the smallest voice can command the loudest attention, because the story is only halfway over. And what comes next is the immediate consequence that solidifies justice in real time. By 6:55 p.m., the atmosphere in Aunt Margie's living room had shifted completely. The laughter that had tormented me just minutes before was replaced by stunned silence and whispered admiration from the neighbors in the doorway. And Tommy's camera continued clicking, capturing every expression, every gasp, and every whispered comment. I could feel the heat of triumph replacing the shivers I had felt earlier, and the faint smell of burnt cookies mixed with pine, and the lingering aroma of Aunt Margie's perfume created a sensory backdrop for the moment of justice unfolding. I watched Larry's face go pale as Aunt Margie held up the receipts I had prepared and said firmly, I should never dismiss her effort, and I owe her an apology. And the words echoed like a verdict throughout the room. Larry stammered, I am sorry I didn't know. And I calmly replied, it's not about not knowing, it's about acknowledging the truth. The neighbors whispered to one another, and on noting the precision with which I had documented everything from the exact $21.63 spent on the train set to the 6 hours I had spent creating the table runner and hanging lights, the evidence was undeniable, and it immediately reversed the social hierarchy in the room. Larry, who had mocked me for more than 30 minutes, now slumped in shame, and Aunt Margie's shoulders sagged with the weight of guilt, and the adults who had chuckled earlier now approached me apologizing sincerely and acknowledging the oversight, and the change was measurable and precise. I could see the subtle trembling in Larry's hands as he reached for the train set to place it carefully back on the shelf where it belonged, and Aunt Margie cleared her throat and said, from now on your contributions will be recognized and respected. And I felt a surge of empowerment. The neighbors clapped softly, some murmured, justice served. And I realized that the humiliation I had endured had been transformed into a powerful statement of accountability. And even Tommy lowered his camera and whispered, you did it, you turned it around. And I could see that the adults around me were genuinely impacted by the demonstration of meticulous planning and courage. I took a deep breath. The room filled with the mingling aromas of pine, cinnamon, and faint coffee, and I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that the balance had shifted completely, and every sneer and dismissive glance had been replaced by acknowledgement and respect, and the repercussions extended beyond just apologies. Aunt Margie immediately began assigning me responsibility for organizing the next family event, consulted me on decorations and seating arrangements, and the neighbors offered their praise, and even some assistance, noting how effective a well-documented plan could be. And Larry, for the first time, experienced the weight of underestimating someone younger and more prepared, and he muttered softly, I never expected this. And I replied with quiet dignity, neither did I until I acted. The room hummed with mixture of relief, admiration, and quiet celebration, and I felt the tangible satisfaction of a strategy executed flawlessly. The soft clink of the silverware as they reset the table, the crackle of the record now playing softly in the corner, and the faint hum of the heater blended into a rhythm of victory. And I realized that justice had arrived in real time. The consequences were immediate, measurable, and deeply felt by everyone present, and I could see the social lessons unfolding in micro-expressions around me. Larry's cheeks flushed red, Aunt Margie's eyes glistened, and the neighbors exchanged knowing glances. The once dominant power of ridicule had evaporated, replaced by a recognition of meticulous effort and resilience, and I could feel the warmth of pride coursing through my small body as the soft textures of my sweater, the rough edges of the crocheted table runner, and the polished hardwood floors grounded me in the reality of what I had achieved. And I knew that this was more than a personal victory. It was a demonstration of accountability, of truth, of patience, and courage paying off, and the room now buzzed with whispered admiration and plans to recognize contributions more carefully in the future. And as I looked around at every face, from Larry to Aunt Margie to the neighbors, I realized that this was the moment where humiliation had been inverted into empowerment, and every small act of kindness and careful planning had culminated in undeniable justice. And if you have ever been dismissed, underestimated, or humiliated in your life, pay attention to how preparation, observation, and courage can turn the situation around, and share this story with anyone who needs to see that standing up strategically can change the dynamics completely and in a very short span of time. As the clock struck 7:10 p.m., the room that had been filled with laughter, ridicule, and dismissal just an hour before now hummed with a quiet respect and a subtle warmth, the soft scent of pine and cinnamon still lingering in the air, the faint hum of the electric heater, and the crackle of the record playing Frosty the Snowman blended into a comforting rhythm, and I could feel the transformation within myself. Like a wave washing over me, the wool of my sweater now felt protective and strong against my skin, and every small detail, from the polished hardwood floors to the edges of the crocheted table runner, seemed to affirm that the effort I poured into this day was meaningful and recognized. And as I looked around, I saw Larry quietly helping arrange the gifts. He muttered softly, I never realized how much work you put into this. And I nodded silently, knowing that acknowledgement was now earned and deserved. Aunt Margie approached me with tears in her eyes and said, I should have paid attention. I should have recognized you sooner. And I smiled softly and replied, it's never too late to change. The neighbors lingered in the doorway, their faces a mixture of awe and admiration, whispering, she really turned everything around. And I could feel a lasting sense of empowerment settling in my chest, and I realized that the humiliation and exclusion I had suffered had been a catalyst for profound personal growth, and the lessons I learned that evening extend far beyond the walls of that living room. The precise observation, meticulous preparation, and quiet courage I had cultivated as a 7-year-old are qualities that carry through life. And if you have ever felt invisible, dismissed, or underestimated, the story is proof that patience and strategy can transform even the most painful moments into triumphs. And as I walked carefully across the polished hardwood to help Mom and Aunt Margie with the remaining decorations, I felt the texture of the handmade ornaments in my hands and the rough edges of the wrapping paper grounding me in reality that small actions with care and thought can create monumental change. And I want you to consider for yourself every moment of effort, every act of kindness, and every sacrifice you made that may have been overlooked, and know that those actions hold hidden power. And I want you to take a deep breath now and feel the strength that comes from persistence, observation, and courage. And as the room filled with whispered apologies, quiet smiles, and tentative offers of assistance, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that not only had I restored my dignity, I had also created a lasting change in the attitudes of everyone present. And from that night on, the Christmases that followed were different, not because the gifts changed, but because the respect and recognition were now permanent, and the lessons in empowerment, patience, and strategy carried through every encounter in life. And I want you to reflect on the fact that even in moments of humiliation, invisibility, or dismissal, there is always a way to rise and turn the situation around. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see that courage and meticulous effort can create justice and transformation. And I encourage you to leave a comment below sharing your experiences so we can all learn from each other. And if you want to see more stories of resilience and empowerment, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and join this community of people committed to recognizing effort and standing up with dignity. And finally, remember the words I whispered to myself that night: I will not let this define me. And they became a mantra that carried me forward every day, reminding me that vulnerability is not weakness, and that even the smallest voice can command attention when used wisely and strategically. And as the lights of the tree reflected in my eyes and the warmth of the living room embraced me, I felt the lasting transformation. And I want you to carry this message with you. Never underestimate the power within you, and know that every act of patience, preparation, and courage has the potential to create lasting change. And now I leave you with this thought: every time you feel dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated, pause, take stock, and ask yourself how you can turn the moment into empowerment. Because your story, your effort, and your courage matter, and they can transform the world around you.